Hey everyone, before we jump in, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future episodes. Today we're looking at something that could have a massive impact on everyone in the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
H.R. 25, the FairTax Act of 2025.
Okay.
This bill proposes a complete overhaul of our tax system,
Huge.
replacing our current income taxes with a national sales tax.
Ambitious.
We're going to try to understand all the potential economic and social impacts.
Yeah.
And we've got a stack of sources to help us unpack it all. We're looking at the actual bill text analyses from think tanks articles, presenting different perspectives on this bold idea.
It is intriguing how the FairTax Act goes beyond minor adjustments, aiming for a complete transformation of how our government is funded. The core concept here is to shift the emphasis from taxing what you earn to taxing what you spend.
Okay, so let's break this down.
Sure.
The FairTax Act would eliminate the IRS.
Wow.
And all the various income taxes we have, personal, corporate, payroll, even estate and gift taxes.
Right.
Replacing them with a single national sales tax.
And that sales tax would be administered primarily by the states. With federal oversight to ensure consistency, the proposed rate is 23%. But this is a tax-inclusive rate. Meaning it's already factored into the price you see. So in reality, you'd be paying close to 30% on top of the listed price of goods and services.
That's quite a leap from the sales taxes most of us are used to. How would this work for families already struggling to make ends meet? The bill aims to address this with what they call a family consumption allowance, a monthly prebate, to help offset the sales tax on essential goods.
This prebate is critical because a simple sales tax without any adjustments would disproportionately impact lower-income families who spend a higher percentage of their income on necessities. The FairTax Act tries to mitigate this by providing monthly payments to households based on family size and federal poverty guidelines. However, the bill itself acknowledges that this approach might not be a silver bullet. Sending out monthly checks to every household is a massive undertaking, raising concerns about potential fraud and the administrative complexities of managing such a system. I'm particularly interested in how effective this system would be in protecting vulnerable families in practice. What are your thoughts on the potential pitfalls here?
I see your point. Logistically, this prebate system seems like it could be incredibly difficult to manage effectively.
Yeah.
And even if it works on paper, there's the question of whether it would truly level the playing field.
Right.
But let's not forget that the FairTax Act paints a pretty stark picture of the current tax system. In the bill's congressional findings section, the current system is criticized for being unfair, complex, and a hindrance to economic growth and upward mobility. It's strong language.
It's certainly interesting how these findings are used to justify such a sweeping change. The bill highlights the administrative burdens, multiple layers of taxation on income, and the negative impact on savings and investment. All valid issues, but is a national sales tax the right solution? That's the heart of the debate.
And speaking of the debate, let's delve into the potential economic impacts. Proponents of the fair tax argue that it could be a major boost for the economy. They claim it would encourage savings and investment by removing taxes on income, potentially freeing up more capital for business growth. They even go so far as to use the Laffer curve as justification,
Interesting.
citing a specific study that concluded the revenue-maximizing tax rate is somewhere between 59% and 70%,
Okay.
significantly lower than the effective rates many Americans currently face.
They also highlight the potential for overall business growth. With no corporate income tax, companies could see higher profits, potentially leading to expansion and job creation. And then there's the simplification argument. Getting rid of the IRS and having a single straightforward sales tax could significantly reduce the administrative burden on individuals and businesses. This point resonates with me. I've always found it fascinating how much time and energy we expend navigating the intricacies of our tax system.
I hear you on that, but of course there are critics who argue that it's not all rosy. They're worried about the potential for the fair tax to disproportionately burden low and middle-income families, even with the prebate. And they also point to the fact that many European countries have shifted away from consumption-based tax systems in recent decades, citing concerns about their regressive nature and negative impacts on social welfare.
Their concern is that even with the prebate covering certain essentials, these families would still end up paying a much larger share of their income in taxes. Plus, eliminating existing tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit could leave those families in a tighter spot.
Right.
And even if the prebate offsets those losses, there are questions about whether it truly captures the full impact of the sales tax on low-income households. And there are broader economic questions as well. Would this new sales tax even generate enough revenue to maintain the government's current level of operations? That's a big unknown. Some analyses suggest the proposed 23% rate might fall short
Really?
if replacing the revenue we get from the current system. This shortfall could lead to cuts in public services or a ballooning national debt.
That's a sobering thought. And what about tax evasion? Wouldn't a consumption tax be easier to dodge than an income tax?
Yeah, I mean,
I can imagine people trying to barter for goods and services or buying things overseas to avoid the sales tax.
that's a valid concern. And it ties into another criticism, the burden on states. The fair tax would shift a lot of the administrative responsibility to state governments.
Right.
And many might not have the resources or infrastructure to effectively handle a national sales tax. We've seen how states have struggled to implement and manage other complex programs, and this could potentially create a whole new set of challenges at the state level.
It seems like there are a lot of potential benefits being touted by supporters and a whole host of potential problems being raised by critics. It's almost like they're looking at two completely different systems.
The reality is that the impact of the fair tax would likely be very unevenly distributed. And that brings us to one of the most hotly debated aspects of this bill, the impact on jobs.
This is where things get really interesting, because both sides make compelling arguments. Let's start with the argument for job creation. How would the fair tax supposedly lead to more jobs?
The primary argument revolves around lower labor costs for businesses. Eliminating payroll taxes would make it cheaper for companies to hire and retain employees, which could stimulate hiring. They also argued that higher after-tax profits would incentivize companies to invest more,
Oh.
expanding their operations and creating more job opportunities.
But wouldn't that create an unfair advantage for larger corporations? They're the ones who would benefit most from those lower labor costs and higher profits. What about small businesses and startups that might not see as much of an immediate impact?
That's an important point to consider. The fair tax's potential impact on the competitive landscape is something that needs further examination. Would it exacerbate existing inequalities between large and small businesses, or would it create a more level playing field? These are questions that economists and policymakers would need to grapple with.
And critics argue that this rosy picture of job creation might not be the whole story. What about the potential for job losses, particularly in the public sector?
You're right, that's a key concern raised by opponents of the fair tax. If the fair tax leads to lower government revenue and budget cuts, it could result in layoffs of government workers. This would not only impact those individuals and families directly, but could also have ripple effects throughout the economy as those workers reduce their spending.
And they're not just worried about the public sector, right? What about the potential impact on wages in the private sector?
Critics are concerned that even if some businesses do expand and hire more people, the overall impact on wages could be negative. Eliminating payroll taxes might sound good for workers at first, but it could actually lead to employers shifting that tax burden onto employees in the form of lower overall compensation.
So instead of paying those taxes directly, employees might end up with lower wages or fewer benefits to make up for the savings businesses get from not paying those taxes. That seems like a bait and switch.
It's a complicated equation with many variables, and it's difficult to predict with certainty what the net effect on jobs would be. One study by the Beacon Hill Institute suggests that the fair tax could lead to a significant increase in employment. But other analyses have been less optimistic, predicting either minimal job growth or even job losses in certain sectors.
And of course, the impact on families is something we need to examine closely as well. It seems safe to say that the effects would be very different depending on your income and how you spend your money.
Absolutely. We've already touched on some of the potential challenges for low-income families. Even with the prebate, they could see a significant increase in their cost of living, and the loss of existing tax credits could worsen their financial struggles.
What about middle-income families? They're caught in the middle, potentially benefiting from lower income taxes, but then facing higher prices on everything they buy. How would the fair tax affect their financial well-being?
It's a mixed bag for middle-income families. They might see some savings on income taxes, but that could be entirely offset by the higher cost of consumption. Whether they come out ahead or behind would depend heavily on their spending habits and how much of their spending is on essential goods covered by the prebate.
I imagine high-income families would likely fare better under this system.
It's hard to argue otherwise. The elimination of income, estate, and gift taxes would be a huge boon for wealthy families, particularly those with substantial savings and investments. Their tax burden would decrease significantly, while their spending habits might not change much, even with the sales tax.
So we have this potential for a major shift in who bears the brunt of funding the government. It seems like a risky proposition with many uncertainties. And you mentioned that there are other options being considered as well.
Yes, our source material mentions other proposals on the table. One option is extending certain provisions from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, such as the lower individual tax rates and increased estate tax exemptions.
That seems like a more gradual approach compared to the radical overhaul proposed by the FairTax.
Certainly. Another option being discussed is something called the Growth Opportunity Act, which focuses on promoting economic growth through a combination of tax cuts and regulatory reform.
That sounds intriguing. What are the key differences between the Growth Opportunity Act and the FairTax, particularly regarding their approaches to economic growth and their potential impacts on different income groups?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the ongoing debate about the best path forward for tax reform in the U.S. The Growth Opportunity Act, unlike the Fair Tax, doesn't advocate for a complete elimination of income taxes. Instead, it proposes a series of targeted tax cuts and incentives aimed at boosting business investment and job creation. It also emphasizes reducing regulatory burdens on businesses, arguing that this will unleash economic potential and lead to broader prosperity.
So while the FairTax focuses on simplifying the tax code by replacing income taxes with a single sales tax, the Growth Opportunity Act takes a more nuanced approach, retaining the income tax structure, but tweaking it to encourage specific economic outcomes.
Precisely. And when it comes to the potential impacts on different income groups, the Growth Opportunity Act frames its approach as more equitable than the Fair Tax. It argues that its targeted tax cuts and incentives will benefit a wider range of Americans, not just those at the top of the income ladder.
But wouldn't those targeted tax cuts still primarily benefit businesses and higher income earners? How does the Growth Opportunity Act address concerns about potentially exacerbating income inequality?
That's a crucial question, and one that has been raised by critics of the Growth Opportunity Act. They argue that even with its emphasis on inclusivity, the Act's benefits would still disproportionately flow to those who are already well off. They point to the fact that many of the proposed tax cuts are geared towards investment income and capital gains, which primarily benefit wealthier individuals and corporations.
So it seems like both the FairTax and the Growth Opportunity Act, despite their different approaches, face similar challenges in ensuring that the benefits of tax reform are shared broadly and don't simply exacerbate existing economic disparities.
You've hit the nail on the head. Tax reform is a complex and contentious issue, and any significant change to the tax code is likely to have both winners and losers. The key is to carefully consider the potential impacts on different segments of society and to strive for a system that is fair, efficient, and promotes sustainable economic growth.
And that brings us back to the importance of understanding the nuances of these policy decisions and engaging in informed discussions about the trade-offs involved. We've delved into the potential benefits and drawbacks of the Fair Tax, as well as touched upon alternative proposals like the Growth Opportunity Act. It's clear that there's no easy answer when it comes to tax reform.
Absolutely. We need to move beyond simplistic talking points and engage with the complexities of these issues. That means considering the potential economic and social consequences, analyzing the distributional effects on different income groups, and weighing the long-term implications for our nation's fiscal health and overall well-being.
I think you've summed it up perfectly. Tax reform is not just about numbers and spreadsheets. It's about values, priorities, and the kind of society we want to create. It's about ensuring that everyone has a fair shot at economic opportunity and that the burden of funding our government is shared equitably.
And it's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. The best path forward will require careful consideration, thoughtful debate, and a willingness to compromise. We need to engage in these discussions with open minds and a commitment to finding solutions that work for all Americans.
I think that's a great message to leave our listeners with. As we continue to navigate the complexities of tax reform, let's remember to approach these issues with a spirit of inquiry, a commitment to evidence-based decision-making, and a shared goal of creating a more just and prosperous society for all.
Well said. And remember, an informed citizenry is essential for a thriving democracy. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those minds working.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the FairTax Act and the broader landscape of tax reform. We've covered a lot of ground, but as always, there's more to learn and explore. Till next time, keep those brains buzzing.